Yeah, it's on. Okay, today we're going to talk about the revelation at Sinai. What reason do we have to believe it's a real event? It really happened. And it's not just like the myths of other ancient peoples which they invented to glorify their ancestors or other purposes. I want to start with a general philosophical introduction. I'm going to present to you a dialogue, and I want your opinion as to what to say about the dialogue. A says to B, do you know who your parents are? And B says, of course. I know who my parents are. Of course I do. And A says, how do you know? And B says, how do I know? I mean, I grew up in the family and they're my parents. And A says, maybe they adopted you? I didn't tell you? Oh, I don't know. B says, come on. I mean, my parents wouldn't do that. And A says, look, you never heard of people who adopted a baby and didn't tell the baby that they're not the true parents? So B says, yeah, well, I have heard of that. I have. So how do you know that they're your parents? And B is now a bit confused and says, I don't know what to say. And A says, see, you don't know that they're your parents. You're just guessing. You're just guessing. Because you can't prove that they're your parents. What do you think about that conversation? Makes you think a little bit. Good. Maybe you're a candidate for philosophy. Who knows?
I look like my father.
I look like my father. The reason is because when they went down to the orphanage, they took your father's baby pictures with them and looked for a baby that looked like your father's baby pictures. And that's why...
Now they have also DNA.
Yeah, you did a DNA test. Well, first of all, I know you did not. And number two, DNA tests aren't 100% accurate. And number three, how do you know that your parent, I should say, those people didn't pay off the lab to give you a false result? Do you know that? Can you prove that? So I guess you really don't know. You must be guessing, yeah?
My question is, if for all intents and purposes you were raised by two parents, right? And they've been the ones to raise you, does it make a difference?
Yeah, it makes a difference. For example, if they have a certain genetic condition, it's very unlikely you'll have it if you're not their child. It can make other difference. It can make other differences as well. Halakhically, in terms of Jewish law, it makes a lot of difference. But isn't there something a little extreme about saying to him, well, you don't know for sure, you can't prove it, you might be wrong, therefore you're just guessing? Is that cover the whole space?
No.
Either you absolutely know for sure without any possibility of being wrong, or you're just guessing? Isn't there something in between?
There's a lot in between.
There's a lot in between. How about having really good reason to think so? When you have in the United States a criminal trial, and they say to the jury, you have to listen to the evidence and see whether there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That means there may be doubts, but if they're not reasonable doubts, the proposed killer was 100 miles away an hour before the act. Maybe he had a helicopter. Can you prove he didn't have a helicopter? So he could have done it. Execute him. I don't think so, because it's not reasonable to worry about helicopters. And they don't happen without somebody seeing them, so on and so on. It's possible, but possibilities don't count. It's got to be a reasonable doubt. Beyond that, you can actually punish him, and in some cases even execute the person. It's not airtight. It's not impossible that you're wrong. But the possibility that you're wrong is so far-fetched, you don't take it seriously. So there's knowing for sure, absolutely. There's guessing, and then there's having good evidence. Good evidence. I trust Joe. He told me it's so, and I trust him. Why do you trust him? I've known him for 6 years. I've interacted with him in many, many cases. Every time I've checked what he said, it's turned out to be true. Couldn't this be the one time he's lying? Is it impossible that he's lying? No, it's not impossible.
Highly unlikely.
But it's highly unlikely because 6 years is a quite long time, and I saw him in a variety of circumstances, so it's reasonable to trust him, even though I might be wrong. Now, I wrote a book called Reason to Believe. When I present reasons to accept the Torah, to believe in God, and so forth and so on, one reflex is to say, maybe it was something else. Isn't it possible it was something else? It's so deeply embedded, the reflex, I think you'll feel yourself jumping to say something like that. My answer is always, yes, it's possible, but it's not probable. I'm not here to rule out all other possibilities. If someone has counter reason to think that something else was the right explanation, then I have to take that seriously. If you have evidence that something else is really going on, then take that seriously. But just because it was possible to be different, that's not a consideration that plays any role in making up your mind what to do. So, I say this because what's the criterion of presenting the right amount of evidence or the right kind of evidence? The criterion is not it's impossible to be wrong. The criterion is it gives you good reason to think you're right, and it puts the critic puts in the critic's court the ball to say, show me counter reason that I shouldn't believe this, not simply to point out that something's possible. Mere possibility just requires a good imagination. You don't have to know anything. But counter evidence requires having studied the subject to know what counts and what doesn't. And it's much harder and therefore it's much rarer. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, we have certain rules for memory that we follow because there's good reason to follow them. Imagine someone who wants to make up a story that's false and get you to believe it. Well, not everything goes. Suppose he says to you, in this false story, he says, yesterday you went swimming. Are you going to believe it?
Yeah, I went swimming.
Yeah, but I said it was a false story. Suppose he's made up a false story that yesterday you went swimming. Are you going to believe it? Probably not. Because you'd say, if I went swimming yesterday, I'd remember that. He's not going to convince you of something which is false, and if it were true, you'd remember it because you know you don't remember it. And you know you will remember it if it was true. You don't live by the seashore. For most of us, I remember the times I went swimming last year. Suppose he said, I was told by your mother that when you were 1.5 years old, you broke your ankle, and you had a cast on for 2 months until it healed. And you think, golly, I don't remember that. How? 1.5 years old? Frankly, I don't remember anything from when I was 1.5 years old. I don't remember anything at all. Maybe he's right. I mean, certainly could have happened, and sure, I would have expected my parents to have told me, but maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe it wasn't important for anything. So when he makes it up and puts it so far in the past that you think, I wouldn't have remembered, then he can fool you. He can tell you something that wouldn't. Now, that's for personal memory. Let's take family memory. Somewhere in your cousins is someone who won the Nobel Prize in 1912 or 20, whenever James Nobel started the prize. And you think, Nobel Prize? One of my cousins. That's not the kind of thing which family would forget. I mean, that's a great achievement. You know, we'd all be proud of it and we'd all talk about it. If my family never mentioned it to me, it can't be right. But suppose they tell you, we've done some genealogical research, and you had an ancestor in Poland in the 1700s who owned a great estate and was quite wealthy and had a lot of workers, and then there was a revolution, he was killed in the revolution, you know, your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. I don't know. Do I have any information about anything in my family for that time? Nothing at all. Even the in-between generation, I have nothing. So maybe it's true. For all I know, maybe it's true. Because even if it were true, my family wouldn't have such a tradition. Okay, you're talking to someone in Great Britain. I know this is painful, I'll keep it short. And he says to you, and he says, you know what somebody told me? Somebody told me that in the 1500s, Great Britain conquered Western Europe, all of Western Europe, and held it for 50 years, and taxed the people and so on and so on. And after 50 years, there was a revolt, and they reverted to their own self-rule. So he says, really? I told you that story? Let's go ask people in France, people in Germany, people in Spain, people in the Netherlands, whether they have any record of this. That's a fairly important historical event. Being conquered for 50 years by the British, taxed the whole continent. Suppose nobody has a record of it. What then will you say of the story?
False.
Can't believe it. That's not the kind of thing that would be forgotten. That's not the kind of thing that wouldn't be monuments to, died in the rebellion against Britain and so forth and so on. It wouldn't be something that would be forgotten, and therefore it's not a story that you can make up. There are certain kinds of stories you can make up, and certain kinds of stories you can't make up. Suppose you have a country, a nation, that believes about its own history such a story. The kind of story you can't make up. Then, that's good reason to think that story is true. Might not be good enough, I'll talk about that in a little while, because certainly it wasn't made up. Now let's suppose you have a type of story like this, where it's hard to make up. And when you look throughout human history, all over the world, you never find a single case where people believe a story like that that's false. Not one. I think the right thing to say is, look, people make mistakes, and groups make mistakes, and nations make mistakes, and they make mistakes of very many different kinds, but it seems, from experience, this kind of story they don't get wrong. I don't know why, I may not have an explanation for it, but from our experience, they don't get this kind of story wrong. Then, if you have no cases where it's proven wrong, when you have a group that has such a story, there's a good reason to think that it's true. Because you never have a case of a human group that believes a story like this, which is known to be false. You never have a known mistake. Now that is a fact about the revelation at Sinai. The revelation at Sinai is a story about our history, and you examine it, examine the kind of story that it is, and you check all over the world, you won't find a single example of a nation that has a story like this, and it's known to be false. Not one. And I think that's a very good reason to think that the story is true. Of course, everything hangs on a story like this. What do I mean, like this? And here's the way I define it. By the way, I wrote a book called Reason to Believe, and this is in that book. I'm talking about a story that a nation believes about its own history, its own ancestors. That an event happened to them, something happened to them, and what happened is something that everyone in the nation experienced it. Everybody saw it for himself. It's not that one person had it and told it to other people. No, everybody experienced it. And it was such an important event that you would expect people to talk about it, to think about it, to write songs about it, to have monuments to it. It would become part of the history of the nation. Let me give you an example of the kind of stories I'm talking about. I'm talking about, for example, wars where we're talking about the victims, the losers. The people who win wars sometimes send armies hundreds of miles away. The armies conquer. The people at home don't experience that. But in ancient times, you had to conquer the territory. You invaded and you conquered, and they surrendered, and they plundered. Everybody in the losing nation experienced it firsthand. Or a pestilence where people died, like the Black Death in Europe, where in 10 years, 30% of Europe died. Everybody was dying all around you. Everybody saw that. Everybody heard about that. Or, let's say, a technological invention. Let's say some fabulous inventor invents bows and arrows. That's going to catch on. That's really important. That makes you much superior in fighting your battles. So the story is, so-and-so invented it at such and such a time, and it spread throughout the nation, and everybody became proficient in doing it. People who were superior and proficient got special prizes, and then we went on to fight our wars. That's something which, according to the story, everybody experienced, and it was a very important change in the history of the nation. That's going to be a very hard story to make up. And, as another example, let's take a public revelation. I'm sure you've heard this point has been made many times. It's a correct point. No other religion starts with a public revelation. Every other religion starts with somebody who says, I'm special, listen to me, do what I say, and all sorts of wonderful things will happen. And he may be charismatic, and he may be good at horseback and throwing a spear, and he may have good looks, and people may believe him. I'm not saying that's totally irrational to believe him. It's not what the story I'm telling you. I'm telling you a story where everybody heard the revelation. Everyone heard it personally. The whole nation heard the revelation. Well, this is a story about our ancestors, and it's a story that says everybody experienced it, and it definitely makes a big difference in the history of the nation. If you have a relation from God, that's not going to be forgotten. According to what we see everywhere in the world, stories like that are never a mistake. As I say, we haven't found a single story of that type that we know is false. That being the case, we have very good indication that the story is true. It's not the kind of story that you could possibly make up. Are we together so far? Yeah.
When you say that you can't prove that it's not true, when you're making a claim, isn't the burden of proof on the person making the claim? So wouldn't the burden be on us to prove that the story is true, not to say, well, you can't prove that it's not true?
It's a good point. It's a good point. Let me show you how to answer it. I have a lake. And I found roe. I know there are fish in the lake. How big are the fish? I tell you, there's not a single one that's 4 inches long. How do you know that? Have you caught any of the fish and seen that they're smaller? Nope. I haven't seen a single fish in the lake. So how could you know that none of them are 4 inches long? I'll tell you how. Because I have a net with holes that are 3.5 inches. And I have dragged the net through the lake daytime and nighttime and high and low 12 times, and I haven't caught a single fish. Not one. So they all must be smaller than that. Even though I haven't found any of them. You can know that a group of things have a certain quality without finding even a single one that has that quality. So it's not true that you have to, and the burden of proof is fine. I have evidence. I have evidence that they're smaller than that. I'm providing evidence. It's just not the kind of evidence of finding them and looking at them. That's not the only kind of evidence that's necessary. Well, it's available and relevant. Now, the critic will say, listen, Rabbi, you're really setting up a straw man. You know, you're setting up an argument which is too narrow, too limited, too unimaginative, and that's why you're able to defeat it. Yeah, maybe I'll go along with you. You couldn't make that story up. But that's not the only way stories get told and stories get produced. What about, and there's a word for this in anthropology and history, myth formation. And here's the idea. Some event happens, an event that's perhaps shocking and disorienting and frightening to the people, to the nation that happens to. And then people tell the story, and they tell the story to their children and grandchildren. And the story is passed down. And little by little, the story changes. Not always accurate what you've been told, not accurate what you say, and the changes accumulate. 50 years, maybe there are a few people still alive to whom it happened. 100 years, nobody left. 200 years, 300 years, the story could change little by little, and over a long period of time, it could change quite considerably. And maybe a natural event, like an earthquake, could, over 300 years, become a supernatural event. Now, everybody heard the earthquake, they all experienced it, so it could be changed into a supernatural event, and people will believe it not because anybody made up the story, but because the changes were so small that nobody noticed the changes as they happened, and 300 years later it's a different story. Why couldn't that happen? So now, it's time for a quiz, but I want to ask you to raise your hands. Why couldn't that happen? Is that what the critic is asking? What's my answer? Of course it could happen. Of course it's possible. I'm not trying to rule out all other possibilities. I'm trying to rule out other probabilities. If you give me reason to think that things like that do happen, then I'll have to tell you that it didn't happen this time. But merely pointing out that it's possible, I give you that. I agree that it's possible. I just don't think it's probable because I don't think we have any evidence for it. So the critic says, okay, yeah, you did say we're not talking about possibilities. I think it's probable. I think it's probable that stories could change that way. So I say, well, let's see. How do you decide that something's probable? Anything. Something happens. Probable to happen. Wouldn't you like it to happen 3 or 4 times in all of human history before now? Suppose you're talking about something that has never, ever happened. Why would you think it's probable? It doesn't sound like it's probable if it never happened. So it really isn't probable. So I don't have to argue against probability. Probability is not correct, and possibility is irrelevant. So making up your scenario that if it happened this and this and this way, this would be the outcome, is a mere act of imagination. And we try not to decide what's true about the real world just using our imaginations. We try to look for evidence, something that you can use to support it, something that really happens. So given that there's no parallel, then you have this conclusion. Now, I put this out 30 years ago in various smaller editions, which I have preliminary editions, and it's quite detailed in my book. Reasonable, and there's a lot of internet discussion of it, and I've answered many critiques of the principle. Usually, the critiques don't pay careful attention to the conditions of the story. I think it was Robert Michener who was in Egypt in the 60s, and he went to a performance in a stadium, and the performers were doing whatever they were doing, and there were people in the stands, and they were very uninterested in talking to one another, and so on and so on. At the end, a sudden hush came over the crowd, and from one side of the stage, you had people in military uniforms, that is to say, British, French, and Israeli military uniforms, coming from one side of the stage. And from the other side of the stage, you had people dressed in Egyptian uniforms, an Egyptian costume. And there's a clash in the center of the stage, and the ones in the Egyptian costume clearly overpowered the British, French, and Israelis and chased them off the stage. And the crowd was on its feet cheering and yelling. So Michener turns to someone and says, what was that? And the answer was a reenactment of the War of 1956. The War of 1956, you can Google it, was where Britain, France, and Israel conquered the new Suez Canal because it was being blocked by Nasser, and they wanted to reassert their ability to do it. And they were chased out by the legions of America and Russia, who told them to leave, and Russia were more powerful. They portrayed it as a military victory. That's crazy. That's not what happened. Okay, how many people observed what happened? The population of Egypt at that time was, 30 million or something. Well, some of the army was there. They participated, some of the army. And the rest of the population, they got the official reports from the government about what happened. Well, they didn't see it. That's not my case. My case is where everybody sees it. If you don't have everybody seeing it, then you can make up stories. At least, from my principle, you can make up anything you want. That's why other religions always make up stories about what happens to individuals. Muhammad ascended to heaven on a fiery horse, all by himself. Thank you. Okay, maybe yes, maybe no, but I haven't got any reason to trust it or to accept it. So, when you look at these stories that people have, the overwhelming experience of mankind, they don't get it wrong. Now, in answer to your question, which applies here now more directly, people ask me, but what about stories like this that are known to be true? Well, there are many of them. In fact, ancient history largely is developed on the basis of stories like that, because the historians will take them seriously. When the Romans have a record, and the record starts, 62 years ago there was a battle and such happened, and the battle was a widespread battle and the whole country was involved, and the record is written down 62 years later where it couldn't have been made up, historians will say that's a valid historical event for this very reason, because not something that you could possibly make up and get a nation to believe under those conditions. Well, what about the stories of other religions? So in the book, I go through that in detail, and you don't find stories like this that meet this criterion at all. And then, as one Roman historian, historian of Rome said, when you read the stories that Rome published, the stories they told their children, the stories they performed in plays and so forth and so on, you have to realize that they didn't believe all of them. It was part of Roman culture and allegiance to Roman values to repeat these stories. Did George Washington really chop down the cherry tree? Did Nathan Hale really say, I regret that I have but one life to sacrifice for my country? Historians will tell you, yes or no. Like, it's in the history books, you read it there, but do Americans really believe it? A lot of Americans say, look, these stories circulated, and we don't know if they're true or not. So if you take an example of an ancient story, you have to make sure that the people who had the story believed it. If they didn't believe it, then it had nothing to do with my principle of when you believe and when you don't believe, when you have evidence and when you don't have evidence. I think that that's a very good reason to believe that the revelation at Sinai is a real historical event. It's not something that was made up. Now, there's the global description. We all stood by a mountain, and we all heard God speak. These are the words that God spoke. And then you have many midrashim, which talk about various details of the experience, which might not be so important and something which everyone would remember. That doesn't mean it isn't true. It just means this particular set of evidence doesn't apply to it. But I wouldn't use it for everything that happened there. Only the things which were publicly observed and publicly experienced. The plagues in Egypt fit this example also. The whole nation, plus the nation of Egyptians, also experienced it. The parting of the sea, also something which the whole nation experienced. These are what I call national experiential traditions. So, people have the kinds of questions which they're relevant to ask. There's nothing wrong with asking them. Not all questions are like that, but these are okay. I say, well, you don't have a record of these events in Egyptian historical sources. If it's such a cataclysmic event, such a gigantic event, why don't Egyptian historical sources record it? And the answer is, in the ancient world, no nation recorded the history of another nation, and no nation recorded defeats. They only recorded victories. Just recently I read that one of the statues that the Egyptians erected to celebrate the victory of a certain battle happens to be that they actually lost the battle. They didn't win the battle, but they celebrate victories. One very striking example was Sancherib. Sancherib was a great general, and he had a great army, and he conquered the whole surrounding area. Our traditions tell us that he attacked Jerusalem, and overnight he lost his whole army. Where do you see that in their traditions? Well, listen to this. We have his memoirs that he wrote, and he had a formula. He said, I came to this city, I surrounded it, I locked them up like a bird in a cage, I broke down the walls, and I destroyed the army, and I looted the treasury, and then went on to the next city. That's the formula that he has for city after city, with one exception, Jerusalem. Jerusalem said, I surrounded the city, end of entry. And then he went on to the next city. Because he didn't break down the walls, and he didn't loot the treasury, and he didn't defeat the army. It didn't happen. What happened? Well, he's not going to tell you that he lost his army. I'm not going to tell you. They don't record their defeats. So it's not surprising that Egyptian historical sources don't have a record of it. And in addition to that, there is one historical source in in, Egyptian history which does mention it. there was an Egyptian priest named, I think it's pronounced Manetho, Manetho, you can look this up, who said that many years ago the Jews were slaves in Egypt, and they got leprosy, and they were infecting us with leprosy, and so that we shouldn't die, we kicked them out. So I read that, I thought, well, that's a spin, all right, an Egyptian spin. It doesn't say it's coming from God and so forth and so on. But, like he made it up. Then I thought to myself, wait a minute. The story that we have in the Torah is very similar to that. Weren't they dying? Yeah, they were dying. The firstborn were dying all around them. Didn't they push us out? It says they pushed us out. We weren't in a hurry to leave. Lo yochlulis b'meya. We couldn't tarry. Kigorshu. They forced us out. So all of that is true. They were dying, and we were the cause of their dying, and they pushed us out. They made it the leprosy part. Okay, this is like 1,000 years later, so that's not bad. So if you're asking why the Egyptians didn't have records in their own history, they only recorded victories. This was a gigantic defeat, and that's one type of problem. Then there's another type of problem, archaeology. Archaeology is very problematic in general. But here's one thing that they believed until very recently. How many people lived in a certain place at a certain time? Well, you estimate that by looking at the habitations. Habitations, houses, last. They can last and they don't get destroyed with time. You can excavate them and you can find them and you can estimate how many people live there. Many years ago, I thought that was very naive because I went to Mexico City twice, and that time the population of Mexico City was 16 million, with 3 million homeless. You're not going to find archaeological evidence of homeless people. No, you're not. Not after 1,000 years or 2,000 years. So it's a little naive to say we estimate the population by the houses, but that was my private observation. About 8 years ago, an article came out in Haaretz, The Land, the most left-wing, atheistic, anti-Torah publication in the country, documenting a certain archaeological find, which turns everything upside down. The article itself says it was everything upside down. In the Arava, they discovered shafts sunk into the earth as part of a copper mining industry. Thousands of them. And they were 10 meters deep or more, and there were tunnels connecting the shafts and smelting places for where they got to the copper to prepare it. Thousands of shafts. How big do you think the population must have been to sink thousands of shafts into the earth? 10,000 at least? Well, with children and everything else, 20,000, 30,000, more? There's no sign of habitation at all. Zero. Nothing. That's because they were visiting from Mars, Rabbi. Obviously, that's the problem. No, I don't think so. So the authors of this study said, well, if they lived in tents disintegrate over thousands of years. So maybe it was a population of people who live in tents, and tents don't survive. Oh, but if that's true, what about your estimates of population for all the other places where you went with houses? Maybe they were living in tents and the population was much bigger. And then you find a verse concerning King Solomon. King Solomon had a certain event, and he invited people from all over the country to come. At the end of the event, he sent them home, and it says they went home to their tents. You know what the archaeologist said? Well, that's clearly poetry. People don't live in tents. No, it just means home to their homes. Of course, they went to their houses. Well, maybe the verse is true. Shock, surprise, astonishment. Maybe it actually was going home to tents. And maybe the population of ancient Israel and the various places in ancient Israel is much bigger than you thought because you didn't take tents seriously. Now you think, what kind of a discipline is this? What kind of an exploration or science is this where you can make a gigantic mistake by just discounting the possibility of evidence? Isn't that a little unimaginative? Isn't that a little unself-critical? I mean, couldn't you have thought maybe we're missing something? No, actually not. And the article said we have to revise all of our estimates. Now, one of the estimates is the population of the Jews in Egypt. And if we say 3 million left, they say, oh, come on, certainly weren't 3 million there. We have no evidence of 3 million people. Well, what kind of evidence are you looking for? Houses? We showed you that doesn't count. And would you expect the slaves to be living in houses? Why? Why aren't they like the homeless people in Mexico City? They're slaves, so maybe they don't have housing. Or minimal housing that disintegrates through time. So you have a lot to be concerned about when someone asks you about archaeology and claims that archaeology shows XYZ. There are revolutions going on in archaeology all the time. And the revolutions sometimes hang on the slimmest of threads. King David, maybe he was a myth altogether. Maybe he never existed. And then they found, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, an inscription, so-and-so, I think it's the grandson of David. Oh. So maybe it wasn't a myth. Wow. One inscription? And all of a sudden, you change your mind? Well, of course you could change your mind. That's very good. But how strong was your position beforehand if one inscription could change it? There was a position that the people were basically illiterate. Then they found on an excavated wall of the temple area an olive base, from olive through base. Olives are tough. Wow, that's in a public place. Maybe they were literate? Maybe? So all of this, when they say that archaeology has proven, discovered, established, take it with a ton of salt. It's not something that you have to take too terribly seriously. So now, if these events are reliable events, and in our case they're miraculous. And let me say again, although I'm repeating myself, but in many of the events of the attacks that I got, I'm not saying we're only talking about miracles. I'm not saying we're talking about revelations. We're talking about losing wars. We're talking about plagues. We're talking about technological inventions, all of which are natural. And we're talking about never making a mistake about those things. In this case, we happen to be talking about a miracle. So someone will say, well, Rabbi, I wouldn't dismiss what you're saying, all of it. I wouldn't just ignore it. But isn't it harder to get evidence for a supernatural event than it is for a natural event? Don't you say something like, the more unique the event is, the more evidence you have to have. The stranger the event, the more evidence you have to have. And I think that's basically right, though it's very vague. I think it's basically right. I think to have evidence that a supernatural event took place, you need more evidence than for a natural event. I think we have enough evidence. I think the evidence is in the kind of testimony that I'm talking about. And I'll give you an example. This is a hypothetical example, but I think it makes the point. Let's imagine someone from ancient Greece who's visiting ancient China. Now the Chinese had star maps, very detailed maps of the stars in the sky. The Greek didn't have that, but of course they did have people who looked in the sky and they experienced the stars like everybody else. And the official Greek position is the stars are unchanging. They're absolutely constant. Nothing ever changes in the sky. And the whole Aristotle taught that, Plato taught that, and it had that whole philosophy of it. Now this Greek is in China, looking at the star map. One night he looks and says to his Chinese friend, something's wrong here. This map isn't accurate. And the Chinese said, listen, we have people who are trained to do this. We believe this is very important. Our maps are accurate. So the Greek says, just take a look. Look, here. Here's the map. Here's a dot. Now look at the sky. Where that dot is, there's no star. So the Chinese says, it can't be. It can't be. But he looks at the map. There's the sky. Wow. Nothing there. Then he says, wait a minute. Turn over the map and check the date. Oh, he turns over the map. It's from 30 years ago. Oh, he said, that's the answer. 20 years ago, that star disappeared. Greek said, what? Star, what? Disappeared? I mean, stars don't do that. You know, Aristotle says they don't do that. It can't be. Stars don't disappear. They never change, ever. And the Chinese person says, yes, they do, because it used to be there, because the chart says so, and it's not there anymore. Well, now the Greeks are in a conflict situation. My culture, my brilliant people, my people who studied the science that they could study, they all tell me the heavens don't change. And these Chinese people tell me the stars do change. The skies do change. What am I going to do? Well, let's see. How reliable are these Chinese people generally? Do they seem normal, reasonable? Do they think about things? When they have arguments, do they change their minds? And are there any other mistakes in the star maps? Just this one mistake? Maybe they're right. Maybe on the basis of their testimony, star maps are just testimony, just things they wrote down. Maybe on the basis of their testimony, I have to change my picture of how the world works. The stars aren't constant. The heavens aren't constant. The heavens do change. A gigantic picture of the nature of the world on the basis of testimony. So I think that reliable testimony can get you to change your mind about what's natural and what isn't natural. So I think that the observation was a good observation, but I think we can meet the criterion. So I think we have adequate reason to believe that the revelation at Sinai and the plagues in Egypt and other miracles that fit this description really took place. If that's the case, this is my last point, and then today's Thursday, maybe on Sunday, if you have questions about this, I'll start with questions and review, and then we'll go on to other things as well. If that's the case, this has a very important, I would say, overall impact. Many people are committed to the world being natural, just natural. I think they have no good reason whatsoever for that. Maybe we can talk about that. But okay, the world is only natural. If I show you 6 events which are supernatural and we have good reason to believe they happened, then you have to change your whole picture of the world. And if I come along and tell you there's a 7th, you won't be as prejudiced as you were before. Your standards won't be so high because it won't be strange anymore. It won't be something that's totally unprecedented, totally different from everything else. Going to 6 to 7 is much easier than going from 0 to 1, because once you have 6, it's not a strange thing anymore. I think that's very important as a general change in your perspective on things. Someone who's against miracles, someone who believes in naturalism, for whatever reason, he's in serious trouble. I'll just tell you why briefly, because the picture of the natural world has changed so much in the last 500 years, he can't tell you what he believes in. Pre-Newton, pre-Copernicus, picture of the world, and today's picture of the world is drastically different. Is he going to wave the flag and say, now we're right, and it'll never change? That's not smart. But if it is going to change, and you say it's natural, what do you mean? Whatever it's going to be natural in 200 years, you don't know what that is. Naturalism becomes an empty dogma. It doesn't have any content that you can define and defend. And that should weaken your adherence to it, or your allegiance to it. Okay, have a wonderful Shabbos.